Hello and welcome to the very first Ohio Valley podcast with State Representative candidate Richard Oliveto. We're kind of chuckling because we did a first take and one of Richard's cats started growling. And we can't, Richard likes cats. And anyway, we started laughing and it's like his cat Toby almost never does that, right?
Right. He just wanted to interrupt. He came over and opposed the whole idea of a podcast, apparently.
I know. I guess Toby was saying there's nothing about cats on the ballot.
Right.
Okay.
And not anything of his interest. So
right.
He was objecting.
Okay. All right. Let's see if we can do this without laughing. Okay. So this is the very first Ohio Valley podcast with State Representative candidate Richard Oliveto. He's running for state rep for the 96th district. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And those counties include?
They include Jefferson County, Belmont County, and Monroe County, parts of Belmont County.
Very good. Okay. Tell us briefly, Richard, what are the job differences between a state rep, state governor, and also congressman?
Okay. Well, the state representative is in a state representative of House, the House of Representatives in the state. It's a branch of the legislature part of the government, which is the second branch of the government. Governor is an executive part of the government. It's sort of akin to the president, where the president is the executive officer and the Congress is the legislative branch. The difference between the state legislature and the congressional legislature, of course, the congressional offices make federal laws, state make state laws, and in this position, it's a representative position where we can introduce legislation that can become law if the majority of the House and the Senate vote and the governor signs the law into existence, then it becomes state law. So it's a legislative function. It's an important position. We also tend to represent people's interests, period, like if there's a problem or a complaint, which is a little bit different than like the governor's office or even a congressional office. Usually a state representative takes on local issues to those communities. For instance, say an aging or housing issue comes up. Somebody might want to call their state representative and see if they can get help with their benefits, or if there's a problem with getting housing or elderly senior citizen care, they can call my office and have somebody address those. We can help them advocate for them. Okay,
nice. I know your dad was a respected judge here in town. How long was he a judge?
32 years.
Wow.
In Jefferson County.
Right. How did he mold you?
Oh, that's a big question. First of all, he was a D-Day veteran, and he came up from West Virginia in the coal fields. He was the son of an Italian immigrant, and he grew up in the 30s in the Great Depression era, when as he often talked about, he had dirt floors and coal and oil lamps, and I think his childhood experience molded him more than even the war, and because he never forgot where he came from, and he was very much a union man. His father was a coal miner from Italy, and they had come over and settled in West Virginia and went immediately to the coal fields and started working. As soon as he graduated high school, the day he graduated, he walked across the stage. He was taken immediately onto a bus and sent to a fort and began to prepare for his work in the Army. And it was he was in the 29th Division, which was the first division to hit the Normandy beach on Normandy, France. And he was in all the battles of World War II. He didn't talk about that like so many of the veterans of that era didn't, but because of that experience in his upbringing and the way he came up, it just gave us a great sense of working for the ordinary person, understanding the complexities of what it was to struggle and what promise America holds for people who can work hard, get a good education. And he emphasized that. He emphasized education in our family. Everybody had to go to school. Everybody was expected to go to school and work hard and play by the rules. And as a son, as he became involved in public service, he was a true dedicated public servant. He took public service as a job for the people, as a sacrifice. You might say it was an old school kind of idea. It wasn't to gain power for power's sake. It was something that he saw as a calling, and that rubbed off on all of us in our family, and we all became, in different ways, involved in different public. My sister became a school teacher, a public school teacher for 27 years. My brother was a lawyer, and he also ran for office and held a judgeship later on in a local county. And all of us seemed to be called to understand history and government. It was almost understood in our family that we would go into some field of government or law or history, teaching history. He ultimately was one, which was, I always said, the most beautiful thing about his life was he just knew every person, and everywhere I went in the state of Ohio, where he held court in 77 counties, and he was often called away from his duties here in Jefferson County. He held court in Cincinnati and Columbus and Toledo and Dayton. He was a true judge's judge, but everywhere I went, whether people won their cases or lost their cases, they all told me one thing: he was the fairest judge that they ever been in front of. And that's the hallmark of what the judge is supposed to be, fair. And if I hope that we can take that attitude into my work and my work as a public servant.
Nice. Rich, if I may ask you, how did your parents meet?
That's a fun question. My mom was here. She was in Steubenville. She grew up in Steubenville, Polish immigrant's daughter. And my father wasn't from this area. He was from West Virginia. But after the war and after law school, he finished Cleveland State Law School in '49. He came to Steubenville to follow his brother to work a little bit in the summer in the coal fields. And his older brother was already working in the coal industry here. So he had a job offer to work with a local coal company as a lawyer. And my mom was always interested in the arts. And at 21 years of age, she was involved with being a part of the production of the Steubenville Players, the local theater. And oddly enough, my dad, he never talked about it, but he was actually in the play. And so she was the prompt and he was the actor, and somehow they met during the play, and about 12 months later they were married, and their first child came 9 months later, so it was pretty quick courtship.
Sounds like a classic Hollywood story, huh?
It was unique, and my dad was, my part of the story was my mom was the one who always encouraged us to get in the arts and, music lessons and even in plays, but my dad never talked about that too much, but here he was the actual actor in that play. He never talked about his big Hollywood moment, but
sounds like a normal family to me.
Yeah.
All right, I know you have a lot of achievements that you're proud of in your background, but maybe tell us one or two of your most proudest personal achievements.
That's a good question, and I do have several. Of course. After raising my only son, Joshua, I would say that's my proudest. But in terms of professional work, is in 1980s I had an opportunity and a privilege to work with a Democratic governor named Richard Celeste and his administration. I was hired after law school into the state labor department. And in that position, I specifically was assigned to the wage and hour division, and we monitored prevailing wage, which is union wages, minimum wage, and child labor laws for the state of Ohio. And several months into the job, I got a chance to start encountering some problems and within the child labor area, and we began to see where 14 and 13 and 15-year-old children were being employed in a fast food industry, which was a good job for a teenager. It gave them some sort of independence and exposure to the workplace, but also we found that the fast food industry in large cities especially was sort of exploiting these young children during the school year. So I worked specifically first with the governor's office, and I wrote a proposal to try to address this. And as a Democratic governor, Celeste was a good Democratic governor, he accepted the proposal, and he made it a priority. So what I was tasked with was specifically going out and finding support to see if we can put a curfew hours or limit on the hours that teenagers can work during the school year in fast food or any industry that would be exploitive. So we worked, and I've worked personally with the Cincinnati superintendents and the Columbus, Ohio superintendent of schools, and there was a wide range eventually of groups that came to assist us, including the homeless coalitions and the faith coalitions of Ohio and other teachers unions, and we built a very strong coalition. And I wrote the final legislative proposal and also became the legislative, what they call lead proponent witness in front of the State Labor Committee, in front of the State House. And in 1988, I gave testimony on behalf of the child labor law proposal that would limit teenage children during the school year's work hours till 10 o'clock at night. On a reasonable, if you're older, 16, you can go to 11 o'clock at night. But for 13 and 14-year-olds, we limited it to even more. So it passed, and we had a very unique legislature that year. We had a House that was controlled by Democrats. We had a governor that was a very positive, forward-looking young governor, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. And that law is still on the books. It's still on the posters in every establishment in Ohio's. And I would say it's my proudest legislative accomplishment. But that same year, I also wrote the first increase in state of Ohio's minimum wage increase. And at the same time, we presented the curfew limits. We presented the minimum wage increase, and I wrote that proposal for Governor Celeste as well. And it's the old adage, Carmen, of if you write something, you're going to own it. So I was in the state labor department, and they said, who are we going to get to basically testify on behalf of this bill, but also counter the counter arguments. And so I, again, was chosen to counter the considerable lobbying efforts against raising the minimum wage in 1988, which was, by the way, it was $2.10 an hour.
Wow.
Yes, and it was astounding to me. Once I got into the department, I was really kind of shocked because we were trying to enforce that law, and we had violations of that law at $2.10 an hour across Ohio. And what was remarkable, our research showed that if we would raise that to $1.35 an hour and make it commensurate with like West Virginia's.
Okay, just a quick correction. When you say 135, you mean raise it by an extra 135?
Yes, it was 210. We raised it by $1.35 higher, so it became at 345 in the next at the raise. So we made it commensurate with other states around us, which were already at 345 an hour, so 335, 345 an hour. So we raised it not to $1.25, of course, but by $1.25.
I think that's what you meant. Okay, fair enough. Okay, good.
We would actually give an immediate pay raise to 80,000 female restaurant workers across Ohio. And we used the that statistic, the 80,000 female restaurant and hotel workers, the people who clean your beds at hotels, and we were going to give them immediate pay raise. And that was the selling point that was able to get it across the goal line. I'm real proud of that because that was the first time in Ohio's wage and hour history that we ever had an increase in minimum wage law in Ohio since it was instituted in the 30s. And so both of those achievements were legislative. I was testifying in front of the State Labor Committee, and a local representative, retired representative, was on the committee. It was Jerry Kropinski. He's well known. He was a highly respected representative in that era, and I had the good privilege of working with Jerry on those bills, and he, of course, helped me get those passed.
So how long did it take to get that law passed?
It took, from the time I testified, it was in the spring or late spring. That was a House. It passed the House, and it went to the Senate.
Yeah.
It was interesting because there were 2 or 3 future Republican governors that opposed those laws, including George Voinovich and Robert Taft, who later they were both on those committees we had to overcome, and they opposed us. on those initiatives. But there were considerable politicians, there were considerable leaders of their parties, one from Cincinnati, one from Cleveland. You can imagine the political weight that they carried. But it took about another 8 months, and they were passed in the early '88.
Okay.
So they became effective, and I believe, if memory serves me right, those laws became effective in 1988.
Okay.
'89 was the first year to be enforced.
Yeah. Nice.
They've been on the law. Now, the minimum wage has been raised a couple times since then in Ohio, and they've kept it up with the federal, and to the credit of the state legislature, even under the more recent Republican control, they've increased this minimum wage. But it took that initial effort to kick it off. And with the curfew law, it's still on the books. It hasn't been changed. And I estimate, I've done some research on that, we have protected probably over 10 million teenagers in Ohio in the last 20-some years from any exploitative practices by having those curfew laws put in during the school year.
It sounds to me like a lot of parents should be thanking you.
Well, I think it was a lot of us. Again, it shows the power of good government. And when I hear, and so when I hear, today we hear that oftentimes, people from different quarters, people say we shouldn't have regulations. Regulations are bad. Well, the child curfew law is a perfect example of good government working on behalf of bettering the welfare, especially protecting our children, because without those regulations on hours, which were reasonable regulations tailored by school officials and superintendents trying to protect students from themselves, from overworking themselves for some money, that short-term gain. And what we found was a lot of the students who were even 16 were having auto accidents because they were tired. Students' performances were going down. Educators were very, very concerned about the level of work that the kids were doing. So this regulation upgraded not only the educational opportunities, but it was literally a health and safety issue. And I firmly believe if we do not have the proper kind of leadership, including the people we had in those days in power in the governor's office and the state leadership, we wouldn't have had that law passed. And we were opposed by very powerful lobbyists. Even lobbyists came in as far as Washington, D.C., and testified against me and what we did. And I had to answer those questions. But thankfully, we had the votes to overcome that. And I believe it's not even an issue today. Most businesses would gladly abide by those laws. I'm sure there's some out there that don't. I've heard some stories, but for the most part, a regulation that actually protects children is not going to be opposed.
Sounds reasonable to me. Yeah. There's still lots to talk about. We'll continue this in the second podcast. But before we forget, when is the primary here in Ohio?
The primary is on March 17th. And, of course, I'm running in the Democratic primary. And I do have a young opponent, and he seems like a reasonable person, a nice person. But we're hoping that we get a lot of turnout, and of course that's the primary, and it'll pick the nominee. Then we have to face off in the fall for the general election.
I want to ask you. I'm not a politician myself, but is this a job that you can do well or learn with on-the-job training, or is this something that you really need to know what you're doing?
I believe you should have the requisite knowledge on the day you start. We're dealing with statewide issues and even national issues that come across. And more importantly, you're dealing with a different level of power structures. And I saw that when I worked in the state labor department. It wasn't anything to be approached by lobbyists, to be offered things. They expected you to know your area. Major law firms will come to you and discuss statewide implications of a law you're proposing. And if you're not really up on understanding the intricacies of these laws or the consequences of your actions, you're going to have a real long learning curve, and it's going to take you years to really catch up with what's going on in Columbus. I've been there, I've done it, and I've been involved in some of the most complex issues. When we did prevailing wage, which was a union wage application, we dealt with projects where $400 or $500 million projects, and we had to make advisory opinions, and I had
400 or 500 million.
million.
Okay.
For instance, we we had to advise local officials in Cleveland on the implications of prevailing wage on the harbor project. And the Cleveland Harbor was built during the years we were there, the new harbor. And I think $157 million was poured into that from state money. And we had to decide whether or not that was going to be built on prevailing wage standards. And, you know, the pressure that is put down on local governments because of that can be considerable. You have non-union contractors that are worth billions coming into the state to build these things, and they don't want to pay those wages sometimes. We have to make sure they got paid. We had to deal with extremely sensitive issues that could make or break a governor's race. And we were the ones put out there, me and myself and the people, the team that I was involved with. And it was pretty heady work to do at 29, 30, 31 years of age. And we did it. I'm real proud of the record that we held. We always had union support. We had a very strong advisory board. But if you go into these positions without really knowing much about Columbus or not knowing much about legislative work, I think you're handicapped and you're not going to be able to represent your people effectively.
So it sounds like you want to get in, jump in, and start doing what you need to do immediately.
On day one.
Okay.
I believe I can take the job and start on day one. Let's say day two.
Okay.
And I'll give it day two.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's still lots to talk about, obviously. Why don't we go ahead and wrap this up? Let's go ahead and wrap this up for the very first Ohio Valley podcast. We'll continue this, of course, in podcast number 2, maybe talk more about your goals, more about your qualifications. And you can submit your questions to an email. What is that email?
I could say to mccr1983@gmail.com, or you can go to my campaign committee site on Facebook. Is We Are the 96th, and that's a Facebook page called We Are the 96th, which means the 96th district is what we're running in here for the State House. And that also has a messaging connection to it. They can leave a message on, and we'll be glad to field your questions and answer any.
Okay. And I believe for campaign contributions, GoFundMe site, that is?
We Are the 96th. Again, that's the committee name, and that'll be the GoFundMe page. We're going to also have an Act Blue page come online soon, but that'll be probably another week.
Okay. Okay. So go ahead and submit your questions, and maybe we'll start answering some of your questions. If you want to submit them, feel free. Maybe in podcast number 2 or 3. Also, finally, I wanted to say that you'll be able to download these podcasts for free. They'll be on the archive.org. I actually need to set up that account. Probably be the same. We Are the 96. I'll have it below in a link below in the show notes. Again, these podcasts are for free to download and listen at your leisure, which I'm sure most people will. All right, let's conclude this one. Rich will have one last comment, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just want to thank you, Carmen, for your time and you taking the effort to do it. And I think it's important that the people of the Ohio Valley need a voice, and that's why I really run it. I feel my advocacy record is very strong in my legal career and in what I did for the labor and wage and hour. And I'd like to be able to be the voice, a strong voice in Columbus for the 96th District. And thank you.
Very good. All right, my friends, we'll catch you on the next one. So, arrivederci.